So I wanted to offer an analysis between the book of Job and Peter being sifted by Satan as referenced in Luke 22, verses 31 to 32. And with this, I wanted to provide insight into Satan's tactics alongside the Lord's intercession, provision, including the reward to come thereafter. So my intent here is that you find this a rich and sobering comparison, and that you too are able to, in your own life, trace a pattern of testing, intercession, collapse, and restoration. So let's take a look at the setting, shall we? Permission before affliction. In Job, Satan appears before God and asks to test Job's integrity. Permission is granted, but with limits. First his possessions, then his health, but we find that his life is spared. In Luke chapter 22, verses 31 to 32, Jesus tells Peter, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail." Let's notice the parallel here, because in both cases, we acknowledge that Satan must ask. We acknowledge also that there are boundaries. This alludes to God not being absent, and we can admit the testing isn't random. The adversary doesn't operate independently. There is a request, there is permission, but there are also limits. And that alone should reshape fear. Let's take a look at Satan's tactics. In Job, we find that he encounters external devastation in the form of a loss of wealth, the loss of his children, and even his health suffering. We acknowledge that he's undergone isolation through misunderstanding friends, but there's also the psychological erosion, his own wife proposing that basically he curse God and die. So we can allude to or point to the goal here being to sever Job's trust in God. Now in Peter, we see an internal destabilization, exposure of overconfidence when he declares that even if all fall away, I will not, as well as fear under social pressure. Where do we find this? Right before Jesus' crucifixion. His denial of the Lord right before, or rather in the presence of the servant girl. So understanding or looking at this, Peter's experience and Satan's tactics, we can identify that the goal was to fracture Peter's identity and confidence in himself. But let's notice something also profound. Job is attacked in his circumstances, whereas Peter is attacked in his self-concept. Both are forms of sifting, and sifting separates wheat from chaff. We understand that it is a violent shaking, exposing what is structural and what is fragile within ourselves and our lives. How about the Lord's intercession? In Job, God doesn't prevent the trial, but he governs it, and in the end, he also speaks. In Peter's case, however, Jesus explicitly says, "I have prayed for you." And this is crucial. Why? Because Jesus doesn't pray that Peter would avoid failure. He prays that his faith does not ultimately fail. Peter will fail. Peter will deny. Peter will weep. But he will not be lost. And that is intercession. Not removal from trial, but preservation through it. And notice the second half of Luke 22, verse 32. "And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." There is assumed restoration. Jesus speaks of Peter's future stability before Peter collapses. That is what we find provision to be. And the reward thereafter, Job's restoration, we find. He's got double material restoration, renewed family, and a deeper revelation of God when he says and admits, "Now my eyes have seen you." The true reward, however, was not wealth. It was intimacy beyond second-hand theology. Whereas Peter's restoration was public reinstatement, which we found in John 21, "Do you love me?" asked by Jesus. His leadership in Acts, boldness where there was once fear, and ultimately martyrdom with his conviction. Peter emerges humbled but unshakable. So the reward there is not comfort, it was authority. Authority that only a broken pride can carry. And so this should beckon the question of what kind of authority are we expecting as we walk this path with Christ. But going back to these two cases, the pattern revealed in both narratives demonstrates that Satan challenges authenticity, God permits refinement, collapse or suffering exposes weakness, intercession preserves the core, restoration produces deeper authority. Satan's tactic is accusation and destabilization. The Lord's provision is boundary and intercession. The reward is maturity and unborrowed faith. So a subtle insight is that Job never curses God, but he questions deeply. Peter denies Jesus, but he weeps bitterly. Both reveal something powerful. The presence of anguish is not the absence of faith. And here's the deeper mystery. In Job, God speaks from the whirlwind, whereas in Peter's case, God himself is the one being denied. Yet Jesus already factored Peter's failure into Peter's failure. Jesus already factored Peter's failure into Peter's future. And that is grace operating before collapse. So, shared pattern, both the book of Job and the Gospel of Luke, they reveal something very specific about spiritual formation. It's not just about suffering, it's exposure. Job's righteousness was exposed to cosmic scrutiny, whereas Peter's loyalty was exposed to pressure. In both cases, what was hidden beneath identity was revealed. For Job, he lost external stability, his theology was dismantled, his sense of transactional righteousness had collapsed. For Peter, his confidence in his own devotion collapsed, his self-image shattered, his courage proved conditional. And I can tell you that my personal journey walking with Christ has cultivated both. I've endured loss that stripped me externally, and I've endured internal exposure that stripped me internally. And that's not small. And so if you're going through it, I can relate, I can empathize. But let's look at the nature of sifting. Sifting doesn't actually create weakness, it reveals it. And once revealed, then two things can happen if you think about it: bitterness or humility. Job moved from secondhand knowledge to direct encounter. Peter moved from self-confidence to Christ dependence. Both emerged quieter, less certain of themselves, but more anchored. So when I speak of emergence, of no longer swimming in trauma, of embracing humanity without losing accountability, that sounds less like triumph and more like integration, doesn't it? Because it's the intent. It's consistent with biblical sifting. But again, the fruit tells the story. After Job, deeper sobriety, less theological certainty, and more reverence. After Peter, less bravado, more courage under fire, and a willingness to suffer without self-assertion. So the real question is not, did I experience what they experienced? It is, what is the fruit now? And it should be less compulsion, less spiritual performance, more embodiment, and more measured tone. And the reward of sifting is not status, it's solidarity, it's solidity. You cannot be easily manipulated by praise or crushed by criticism once you have been exposed and restored. You cannot be seduced by grandiosity once you have seen your own fragility, and that is necessary if you intend to lead, guide, or speak publicly. Authority without sifting is dangerous. Authority after sifting is stable. So let's also remember that Job never declared himself spiritually superior after his restoration, and Peter never centered his narrative on how severely he was tested. They became quieter servants, and this emergence led to simplicity, responsibility, faithfulness in small things, and a steady discipline. And if this relates with you and to your journey or where you find yourself, know that you're passing through something formative. If it leads to subtle exceptionalism, I need you to pause. But if what I've shared with you and I've expressed resonates, then I would believe that that alludes to a sense of integration and not inflation, and that is good. My name is Michael Ramirez. I am a follower of Christ, not in a religious sense. My lived experience, guidance from the Spirit, the length and depth of my journey. I pray that if you are struggling or trying to make sense of your life, God, Christ, spirituality, the works that I have been producing have been beneficial to you. And if you are interested in collaborating one-on-one, you can find a link to my link tree in my bio. I look forward to working with you. Thank you and take care.